From the Origin of Life to the Great Oxidation Event, Episode 1. So this is the first of 5 episodes that take you from 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago on Earth. And the Earth was a very totally different thing when you compare 2.5 billion years ago to 4 billion years ago. So amazing things happened in this period, and we're going to learn what we know about that. Well, one of the things we know about that is at that time there were not yet any animals or plants. So everything that happened was done by microbes, invisible organisms. And before we go and talk about what those microbes did at that time, I'm gonna tell you what we know about what microbes are doing today. So microbes meddle with the earth. They change the earth. They interact with the earth. And I'll show you 3 examples of how they do that. So the earth's temperature is regulated for a large part by the greenhouse gases in its atmosphere. And the important ones are water, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And microbes turn over these molecules. They produce them, they consume them, and they set the concentrations, changing the temperature on Earth. Now, another way microbes can change the Earth's temperature is by meddling with the albedo. So the albedo is a measure of the reflectiveness versus sunlight. So and how much of the sunlight that hits the Earth bounces back into space. So you see that in contrast to the concentration of greenhouse gases, there's no long-term effect where humans are having on the albedo at this moment. It's kind of stable. But you see, for example, that currently the North Pole has a decreasing albedo because of ice loss, because of deposition of soot, etc. When you have a nicely green body of water or the ocean or forest that has a very low albedo. So that's another way how life meddles with the planet and sets the temperature. Even more surprising, so life also contributes to plate tectonics. So there was a really nice paper published in 2019, so this year, that shows that ice ages catalyze plate tectonic activity, and that's because they generate a lot of weathering. So one of the things that life does, it also really increases the weathering of rocks, creating more sedimentation, and those sediments lubricate the plates. And that's also what you see during Earth's history. The plate tectonic activity increases. So those are 3 ways how life meddles with the planet. Here's a nice example of how that goes in practice. So humans are currently performing a really interesting experiment with the Earth that will lead to enormous change over the next couple of centuries. We are just adding a little bit of extra CO2 to the atmosphere and see how that works out. And the IPCC keeps very careful track of that. So this figure shows how those let's say, different processes and rates of emissions and uptake of CO2 are changing as we add more CO2 to the atmosphere. So you see, for example, the large turnover of CO2 in forests, in the oceans. Those are really big processes. But also you see a couple of smaller, slower rate processes such as volcanism and weathering that are geological. And so in geology, there is another carbon cycle, which is sometimes called the slow carbon cycle, which will kind of end the human experiment over millions of years. So ultimately, the temperature will bounce back. And that works as follows. So as you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, that stimulates weathering. So you get more weathering of calcium into the ocean. In the ocean, calcium will precipitate, as calcium carbonates, eliminating CO2 from the atmosphere. Those precipitates will be buried and ultimately be fed back to the atmosphere. So this is a slow carbon cycle that keeps the temperature under control on a longer time scale. Now, as you think about those element cycles and the way life works, it's important to use or to know a few concepts. So what we talk about are compartments. So those are things like the ocean, the terrestrial biosphere, the atmosphere. Those are compartments. Then we have reservoirs. So reservoirs are the amount of a certain element that sits in a compartment in a certain form. So, for example, we have the reservoir of CO2 in the atmosphere. We have the reservoir of biomass on the terrestrial parts. We have the reservoir of dissolved CO2 in the oceans, etc. Fluxes are when the element moves from one compartment to the other. For example, CO2 absorption by the ocean is a flux. And transformations are what life does. So, for example, photosynthesis, conversion of CO2 into biomass, that's a transformation. Right? Those things are ways to kind of make sense of those element cycles. Now, I would like to talk about what life actually consists of. So we know, as far as we understand, we can say there's kind of three general flavors of life. There's the prokaryotes, the eukaryotes, and the viruses or phages. And so prokaryotes are what most of those invisible microorganisms are. So they're cells. That means they have a membrane that separates them from their environment. They have a cell wall which provides them with structural strength. Inside that membrane sits it's just one compartment. Everything is just a bag of proteins and DNA that perform all the metabolism of the cell. Sometimes they're motile. They have a tail to move around. So those are prokaryotes. Now eukaryotes are what we are. So eukaryotes are much bigger cells than prokaryotes, and because they're so big, they have different compartments, and all these compartments have different functions. So that's a real difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Another really important difference is that the cell wall of the eukaryote is more flexible. And so what it can do is it can move its membrane and cell wall around to engulf something like another organism. So it can eat other organisms this way. That's something bacteria, so prokaryotes, cannot do. Finally, there's the virus. A virus that infects a bacterium or an archaeon is called a phage. But essentially, it's the same thing. The virus is not a cell. It has no metabolism. It doesn't do anything. It's just static. It floats around, and once it meets a cell, it will attach and inject its genetic material, generally DNA, into that cell. That will reprogram the cell to make many, many viruses. And so it's kind of a predator of cells. Now, today, what do we know about how important each of those forms of life is? Well, when you look at the total biomass on Earth, most of that is plants. Animals are really only a very small part. And of course, we are part of animals and are even smaller parts. When you look at the invisible organisms, so these are the bacteria, archaea, the viruses, they make up about 15% overall. Where are all those bacteria? Well, they are in a place we can't see them very well. They're generally below the ground or below the seafloor. That's where most bacteria and archaea are. So that's why some, see microbiology as a part of geoscience, and I'm a microbiologist, part of the geoscience department. Yeah. Okay. And then also important is even though, let's say, in mass, they're 15%. Actually, a number of organisms, because they're so small, they're a very big, much bigger proportion. So most organisms on Earth have viruses, followed by bacteria and archaea. They're tiny. So, to conclude episode 1. So Earth's atmosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere, they're dynamic, and they interact with each other. So, for example, the biosphere acts on the greenhouse gas concentrations and Earth's albedo. And the biosphere also increases rates of weathering and sedimentation, lubricating plate tectonics. So, the fast and slow carbon cycles are what sets the temperature on Earth. And when you think about element cycling and greenhouse gases, you could discuss that as transformations, fluxes, stocks, and compartments. Um, So life comes in 3 basic flavors: prokaryotes, eukaryotes, viruses. And even though they're invisible, they make up about 15% of Earth's biomass. Episode 1.